Imagine opening your eyes and realizing the day hasn't even started yet. There is no alarm clock, there is no comfort, there is no choice. The only thing that exists is the cold. We are in the year 1348, and you are not in a house. You are in a small, crooked wooden hut with a dirt floor that's damp and hard. The air is heavy, thick with the strong smell of smoke, wet straw, and animals. Because yes, the animals sleep there too. A goat tied near the door, a few chickens roosting in a dark corner, and maybe a small pig trying to warm itself in the same space where your family sleeps. Now look around. In the same room there are 6, maybe 8 people. Your parents, your siblings, maybe your grandparents, all sharing the same cramped space, lying on piles of dirty straw that serve as beds. There are no separate rooms, there is no privacy, and often there's not even silence. All night long you hear coughing, moaning, the sound of animals moving, and the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. And then, just when it feels like you've finally closed your eyes and someone wakes you, it's still completely dark outside. Maybe 3 a.m., maybe 4. It doesn't matter. The work starts before the sun rises, your body aches, your feet are cold, your hands are already cracked before the day even begins. But you get up, because you're not going to work for yourself. You're going to work for the feudal lord who owns all that land, every field, every tree, every animal, and in a way, every person too. You step out of the hut and feel the icy pre-dawn air cut across your face. The village is still quiet, but slowly, other doors creak open. Other serfs are stepping out too. Silent shadows walking in the darkness, carrying crude hoes, worn shovels, empty baskets, all heading to the same place, the Lord's fields. Because in that world, your life was already decided the moment you were born. You don't choose your work. You don't choose where you live. You don't choose your future. Your destiny is simple. Work until your body can't take it anymore. And this, everything you just imagined, was only the beginning of the day. The real suffering of a medieval serf hadn't even started yet. But before we continue this brutal journey through the reality of 1348, if you like stories that reveal the rawest and most forgotten side of human history, go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because in the next part of this video, you're going to discover something most people have never realized about the life of serfs, something that makes this existence far more terrifying than it already seems. And once you understand how the system worked, you'll realize that for millions of people in the Middle Ages, freedom simply did not exist, and that's exactly what we're going to reveal now. Now imagine something even more disturbing. You were born in that village, but it doesn't belong to you. In fact, nothing there belongs to you. Not the land, not the hut where you sleep, not the fields you've worked since you were a child. Everything belongs to the feudal lord, a nobleman you might only see a few times a year, living in a distant castle, surrounded by stone walls, abundant food, and armed soldiers. And you? You were born bound to that land, literally. In feudal Europe, a serf could not simply decide to leave. You couldn't wake up one day and say, "I'm going to try my luck in another town." That would be considered a crime. If a serf fled the village without permission, he could be hunted, captured, and forcibly returned. Because in practice, the serf was part of the property. He wasn't sold individually like a slave, but he was tied to the land. If the land was sold, the serf went with it. Now think about what that means for your life. Every day you work your small plots to try to feed your family, but several days of the week, you don't work for yourself. You work for free, in the Lord's fields, plowing his land, planting his wheat, harvesting the food that will be stored in the castle's barns. Meanwhile, your own family often barely manages to save enough for the winter, and it doesn't stop there. Beyond the mandatory labor, there are the feudal taxes. Taxes on the harvest, taxes to use the mill, taxes to use the communal oven, taxes to maintain the roads, and sometimes taxes simply because the Lord decided he needed more money. But perhaps the most shocking part is this. Even getting married required permission. If you wanted to marry someone from another village, you had to ask for approval. If you wanted your daughter to get married, the Lord had to approve that too. In some parts of medieval Europe, even the right to inherit a small piece of family land required a payment to the Lord. So in other words, every decision in your life went through someone else's control. That's why many historians say something harsh but extremely realistic. The medieval serf wasn't much different from a slave. The only difference is that he wasn't sold individually. But the brutal truth was this: you didn't work to live, you lived to work for someone else. And even so, all that psychological weight still wasn't the worst part. Because while the system imprisoned your life, the daily labor was slowly destroying your body. When the sun finally appears on the horizon, the work has already been going on for hours, and it only ends when the sun disappears again. In practice, that means something that today seems almost impossible. 14, sometimes 16 hours of work per day. No machines, no tractors, no technology, just human strength. And extremely simple tools: a heavy iron hoe, a crude shovel, a plow pulled by oxen, and even those tools were considered a privilege. Many villages had very few implements which had to be shared among several families. Now imagine plowing an entire field like that. The soil is hard, stony, full of roots. Every yard requires effort. You push, pull, lift, dig, over and over for hours, for days, for years. Your hands quickly become covered in blisters. Then the blisters burst. And over time, the skin turns into a thick, cracked, scarred layer. Bleeding while working wasn't rare, it was normal. And it didn't matter the weather. If it's hot, you work. If it's raining, you work. If the wind is freezing, you work. The harvest doesn't wait. Winter doesn't wait. And hunger, even less so. Even the children participated. Boys and girls started working very early, carrying water, helping in the fields, tending the animals, because every pair of hands was needed to keep the family alive. Over the years, the body starts paying the price. Crooked spines, destroyed joints, constant pain. Life expectancy was low, and many adults already looked elderly before 40. Imagine finishing an entire day working in the fields, exhausted, covered in dirt, hands burning and back on fire. And even then, there's still something worse waiting for you, because despite all this brutal work, there was an enemy no serf could control, a silent enemy that returned every year. And that destroyed more lives in the Middle Ages than entire wars: hunger. And when it arrived, all that effort could mean absolutely nothing. Now imagine working every day until exhaustion, and still not being sure if you'll eat tomorrow. For a medieval serf, food was never guaranteed. In fact, most families lived constantly on the edge of starvation. The base of their diet was simple and repetitive: dark bread made from coarse grains, a thin vegetable soup, maybe a little oatmeal. Meat? Almost never. Animals were far too valuable to be slaughtered frequently. A hen laid eggs. A cow gave milk. An ox was needed to plow the fields. Killing an animal meant losing a survival tool. So the daily diet of millions of people was practically the same. Every day, for years. But the real problem wasn't just the simplicity of the food. It was the fragility of the system. All survival depended on the annual harvest. If the weather was bad, if the rain came at the wrong time, if a plague attacked the crops, the food simply disappeared. And when that happened, villages plunged into a brutal cycle of scarcity. Families began rationing every crumb of bread. Parents ate less so their children could eat. Soups became thinner and thinner. Bread became smaller and smaller, until sometimes the bread stopped being bread. Chroniclers of the time describe something disturbing: people mixing straw, sawdust, and even tree bark into the flour. It wasn't real food, it was just something to fool the stomach. In truly desperate years, people started eating the unthinkable: roots pulled from the ground, bitter herbs, moss, anything that could be chewed. And even then, many children didn't survive the winter: weak bodies, swollen bellies from malnutrition, sunken eyes that looked too big for their faces. Hunger was so common that it became part of everyday life. But then came a year when hunger stopped being just a problem and turned into an absolute nightmare. The year when something invisible began traveling along Europe's roads, something that would turn entire villages into silent, abandoned places. The year 1348, when death began knocking from door to door. At first, no one understood what was happening. The first stories arrived through travelers and merchants, strange rumors from distant cities, people suddenly falling ill, violent fevers, bodies covered in dark spots. But in the Middle Ages, disease wasn't new. So at first, many believed it would be just another passing epidemic. They were terribly wrong. When the disease finally reached the villages, it seemed to appear out of nowhere. A neighbor would wake up with a fever. The next day they could barely stand. Shortly after, painful swellings appeared on the neck, armpits or groin, large dark lumps called buboes. The pain was intense, the fever rose, and in many cases, death came in 2 or 3 days. It was fast, too fast. Entire families fell ill at the same time, parents, children, grandparents, all inside the same house. The few doctors that existed didn't know what to do. Some tried bloodletting, others prayed, nothing worked. Priests were called to give last blessings, but many of them got sick too. In some regions, even the doctors and clergy began to flee. Entire villages collapsed. Fields were abandoned, houses stood empty. In some towns, there were so many dead that there was no longer time for proper funerals. Bodies were piled into mass graves. Carts rolled through the streets collecting corpses. And the most common sound stopped being fieldwork and became the constant tolling of church bells announcing yet another death. Some villages disappeared completely. They simply ceased to exist. For a medieval serf, surviving had always been hard. But that year, surviving a single week was already considered luck. When we look back and try to imagine the life of a medieval serf, it's easy to think the worst was the plague. But the truth is far more terrifying than that. The Black Death was only the final blow to a life that had already been brutal from the start. Because even without epidemics, simply existing in the Middle Ages was already a constant battle. Average life expectancy was extremely low. In many regions of medieval Europe, half of all children didn't reach adulthood. Simple diseases that are treatable today were death sentences. An infection in a cut, a high fever, a bad flu. Without antibiotics, without hospitals, and without advanced medical knowledge, the human body was practically alone against any illness. And that wasn't all. Wars between kingdoms were frequent. Armies marched through fields and villages, looting food and destroying crops. When an army passed through a region, it often left behind only burned houses and empty fields. And then came winter. Long, cold, relentless. Without enough food stockpiles, many families simply didn't survive until spring. Hunger, disease, extreme labor, violence. All of this was part of normal life for millions of people. That's why, when historians examine the records from the time, one conclusion keeps repeating. Medieval life was far harsher than most people today can even imagine. Now pause for a moment. Look around you. Today we complain when the internet is slow, when the air conditioning breaks, when the supermarket is crowded. But the reality is that we live in a world that would be considered almost magical to someone from the 14th century. We have food available every day. We have advanced medicine. We have heating, electricity, transportation, comfort, things that medieval kings couldn't even dream of having. And perhaps that's the most powerful reflection of all. Modern civilization has created such a thick layer of security that we've forgotten how fragile human existence once was. For most of history, surviving to old age wasn't the rule, it was a miracle. Because the simple truth is this: modern civilization has made us forget just how brutal it once was to simply exist.